Good morning. Let's take a trip back into history. So we're here in San Antonio in Philippines Museum. A lot of the stuff you're going to see here, most museums, they don't have, or it's been deemed unsafe for most people to see. But let's take a look. So you can see here we have a lot of American and Japanese artifacts from pre-war, during the war, and a little bit of post-war. And let's dive into some unknown facts. So if we look here, early Marines, they were issued World War I items, not World War II. Some instance, we got a 1918 brass knuckle knife. The knife has been corroded, but most Marines, this is what they would carry, because of the old trench knife. Some got the later model combat knives, or K-bars. These were issued later on in place of the trench knife. Now, a specialty one is Fairbanks Sykes trench knife or stiletto knife. This knife was used by Marine raiders during the pre-invasion. So this is what it looks like now, and here is a modern replica. You can see it's designed for penetration of the human chest, the back of the neck. You can see it's supposed to go all the way in from the bottom end. And when you talk to original SAS soldiers from Europe, they're the ones who taught the Marines how to use these. And you wouldn't hold it like a modern combat knife, where you come like this or like this. They were taught to hold them like this. The reason being is when you come up, you're meant to insert between the ribs or in the soft part of the skull. They're meant for silent killing and meant to be fast. If we come here, so if we all remember Saipan history, one of the major battles was the final bonsai attack. A lot of people think, well, the Marines, they fought them day and night, which they did. However, right here, it looks like a piece of metal. But this is actually one of the most important pieces to that battle. It's the remnants of what we call canister shot. It'd be just a regular canister, and if you can see in here, there's these little divots where the glue would hold little pellets. Think of it like an oversized shotgun shell. And the Marines on the ground with the light tanks and the light anti-tank guns would use these all night to repel large amounts of Japanese attack waves. So this was very crucial for American soldiers during that battle. Now, also in history, we talk about how the Japanese were ill-equipped because the fighting between the Admiralty and the generals, they couldn't decide who got all the funding. So therefore, their tanks were outdated, their weapons were outdated. However, something most people don't know is that the Japanese were actually well equipped by this time. As we can see here, if you look at most of these machine guns, these are heavy machine guns, right? So we have a Japanese Nambu 7.7. It's the equivalent to the 30-06. Now these are the interesting ones. We think Americans, we all had 50 cal, which is a larger caliber that can penetrate light armor. Japanese also had a similar version, which is for anti-aircraft use, 12.7, similar to Russian 50 caliber. We were evenly matched at that point. It's just we had more equipment and more availability, whereas the Japanese did not. They already had supply issues by that point. So if we come back here to the Japanese side, I can actually go further by what I mean. Now, the Japanese were more creative with how they use their equipment because of their limited supply. One being, the Japanese were very well trained under the old samurai traditions with samurai swords and modern bayonet techniques. So we look here on a traditional Japanese mid-war 7.7, this bayonet still attaches properly. It attaches all the way down. Same thing as the 6.5, same thing. The same barrel diameter for the barrel and the same mounting lugs. Now, the one and only things that most modern weaponry do not see is like this Japanese light machine gun. As you can see, it has a bayonet lug and a mounting point on the gas port. So if you took the Japanese basic bayonet, it would actually fit in properly and it would seat on that gas port. It was one of the only weaponry, even to this day, that uses a bayonet on a light machine gun. Because one basic technique was, for the Japanese, their version of lightning or blitzkrieg was the bonsai charge. Hence why most Japanese machine gunners had bayonets on their light machine gun. Now, most Japanese machine guns, they were licensed and copied through the Europeans, like this old Hotchkiss design, Nambu, where instead of it having a traditional belt fed, you had this old school feeding system. It would be longer, but this one's been cut off. So if you see here how it slides in, this top piece is actually an oiler. You would load oil from here and there'd be a brush. And it required a lot of oil to brush the ammunition in order for the weapon to cycle properly, whereas most modern machine guns had a different way of feeding the weapon. Here's another example of a Japanese 50 caliber machine gun. As you can see here, it's a top loading mechanism because it's only meant for anti-aircraft use. And now if you look up here, this is actually a sporterized Japanese rifle, most likely from an American, because you can see where they cut down the actual weapon and they brought everything backwards. Because most Americans, when they're using their old hunting guns, they were shorter, hence why they cut all this off. Most likely this was supposed to be a bring back and the Marine lost it. So we come back here. Another rare item that hasn't really survived is the knee mortar. Now, given the name, most GIs, they thought you would place it on your thigh right above the knee. So when they would launch the mortar, it actually would shatter their bone. It's really a bracing point right here to base onto the ground when you fire it. So, for an example, see how it's cupped? Some people thought this is how they would fire the knee mortar. But when it would launch, all the gases that would come off of this mortar back here, when they launch it, it would actually shatter their bone. Now, the weird thing that most people don't get to see about the knee mortar is this rod. This rod in here, they think, well, because the rod's in there, how do you add the round? This rod is actually a device where you would screw up and down on the knee mortar, and that's how they adjust distance, whereas traditional mortars, they use an elevator. This was the Japanese version, and down here would actually have all the markings for how far you would go down and up. Right here is the original trigger, where you would pull down and it would actually send off the round. Over here you have a few remnants of Japanese helmets that have survived throughout the years. Obviously in rough shape, but those are actually some of the rarer stuff. Over here you got a large magazine for the large anti-aircraft gun. Some leftovers from the bonsai charge. This was actually found in the waters where the Japanese were charging down from the mountains when they were gunned down. So, leftovers of shoes, Admiralty plates. These are plates that normally the Navy would give in their mess halls. Generals and higher officers have their special plates, but we don't have any on display at the moment. Another thing is a rarity. These two machine guns, they're actually some of the lesser known weapons of the Japanese arsenal. This is actually a 20mm that's been copied off of a different design, the Orlikon. This design is actually still used in US military today for the ships. So it was very common to see these Swedish designs being used in all different parts of the world. The Germans had their own copy, this is a Japanese copy, and the Americans had their copies on ships. This one specifically is actually an aircraft mounted Orlikon. You can still see here, it still has its original solenoid when it would be mounted. And a very, very lesser known fact, if you look up here, toward the end of the war, most people don't realize that the Japanese still used flamethrowers. And this is one of the last only remaining flamethrowers from the Japanese here on Saipan. Most GIs, they would actually take these flamethrowers and use them against the Japanese. And later in the war, as time went on, we had things called the last ditch weaponry. So last ditch, these were weapons that were constantly taken and they were just cutting back on material and using whatever they could. One being are Japanese hand grenades. So these are actually early war, but later war, the last ditch, they'd be just made of a flatter material. They actually wouldn't have these grooves anymore for shrapnel. And here's an example of an actual late war. So this is a ceramic hand grenade. Same premise, but they would save on the precious metal. So now they would just make ceramics. Still have the same effect. You can still add the same amount of powder and use the same charges, just now in ceramic form. Also, one of the things that you don't see very often. And right here we have an early war Nambu. Reason being is because in early war, you would have the shorthand trigger guard. It wasn't very popular with the Japanese because they were always using gloves in ceremony and most officers. So most officers, they would complain that the glove would be too thick to fit around the actual handguard. So later war, they actually had the elongated trigger guard, which I believe we have one over here. Yes. So this elongated handguard, it's very rusted, but you can see how there's more trigger space. Whereas on the older one, there would be less trigger space. Now I know we've talked about some European designs that's been transferred over from Europe to the Japanese arsenal. One that's actually really unknown, at least for most people, is the Lewis gun. The Lewis gun was a fairly decent weapon in World War I. You see here, this is actually a version of the Lewis gun, but converted for Japanese use. So this is a Japanese produced version of the Lewis. And here's the actual magazine chambered in 303 British, or in this fact, rechambered to 77mm Japanese in the unfamiliar rim, where the rim is widened in the back like the 303. Oh, I hope you enjoyed. There's a lot more we can go through, but if you want to know, we can actually just come down and spend time with Fabian and see what you can find out. Oh, the chrysanthemum. So, with the chrysanthemum, every Japanese soldier, when they were issued a weapon, more a rifle, they had a chrysanthemum, which was the seal of the empire. When Japanese soldiers would ditch these weapons, they would remove the bolt like this one, but what they would need to do is shave off this chrysanthemum. The reason why this one's still intact is probably because the soldier didn't have enough time to remove this chrysanthemum. Because this is what's considered a gift from the emperor, in order to not shame the emperor, they would have to shave this off before they ditched it. Let's see if we can find one that was done. Nope, that one's still intact. Oh, so we don't have one that's been shaved off, but a lesser known fact was the chime. Japanese rifles, most modern day, most Japanese rifles, when you find them, you see them barren like this, with the bolt obviously. But there's actually a dust cover. And it's been talked about in many different things like History Channel and Japanese experts who followed the war up here. This is actually an original dust cover with the weapon. The problem with this dust cover is that it's metal. So when you would actually chamber a new round, it would cause this chiming sound, which will alert most soldiers, especially if you're trying to be hidden, where you were. All right, I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Muna, an active duty army and stationed in where?
Korea.
All right, and you are here on
Leave.
on leave, right? And all right, so that's Peter Muna. Yeah, we're related cousin, and he's very knowledgeable, as you can see, about all of these relics. And eventually, he's retired. I kind of believe that he would be the one to be doing a lot of the touring for future new generation. Yeah. Once I'm gone from this world, like I said, I'm very impressed of his knowledge about a lot of this stuff, and that was just a little bit of it. No, other than, as you can see, there's so much in there that it could go on and on and on. So thank you again, Peter, for coming today.
Yeah,
and see the small shit.
It's always fun.
All right. Okay. So again, Apatalo si Vivian. Adios.